the jet that broke every rule, how America learned to kill the unkillable. The radio crackles. "Bandit, 12 o'clock high." Lieutenant James Hartley doesn't see it at first. He's flying bomber escort over Bavaria in July 1944, scanning the sky the way he's done 100 times before. Then something streaks past his B-17 so fast it doesn't seem real. No propeller wash, no engine roar he recognizes. Just a grey dart that violates every principle of aviation he's learned in 3 years of combat. Before he can key his mic to report it, the thing is already 2 miles away, banking hard for another pass. His top turret gunner swings frantically, tracking what looks like a target painted on glass. The guns roar, tracers arc into empty air. The German aircraft accelerates away like Hartley's bullets are moving in slow motion. The Luftwaffe just rewrote the rules of air combat, and every Allied pilot in Europe is about to become obsolete. The Messerschmitt Me 262 wasn't just faster than anything the Allies flew. It existed in a different dimension of physics entirely. While a P-51 Mustang topped out at 440 mph in level flight, screaming along at maximum power with its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine pushed to the red line, the Me 262 cruised at 540, not maximum speed. That 100-mile-per-hour gap wasn't a margin. It was an insurmountable chasm that rendered 3 years of hard-won tactical knowledge completely worthless. Imagine you're chasing someone on foot. You're fast, trained, one of the best runners in your unit. Now imagine the person you're chasing gets into a car and drives away while you're still sprinting at full speed, lungs burning, legs pumping. That's what propeller-driven fighter pilots faced every time they tried to intercept an Me 262. Every maneuver they'd perfected, every piece of combat wisdom earned through blood and burning wreckage, became instantly obsolete the moment those Junkers Jumo 04 turbojets spooled up and started screaming. The Germans knew they'd built something that didn't just change air warfare. They'd created something that made air warfare, as the Allies understood it, completely irrelevant. Messerschmitt's engineers had given the Luftwaffe a fighter that could simply ignore Allied escort groups. When P-51s or P-47 Thunderbolts dove to intercept, diving from altitude with every advantage of position and energy, Me 262 pilots just pushed their throttles forward and watched the Americans shrink in their rearview mirrors. No prolonged dogfight, no burning precious fuel trying to outmaneuver a more nimble opponent, no risky defensive scissors or desperate barrel rolls. Just raw physics-defying speed that turned air combat into a one-sided demonstration of technological supremacy. And it wasn't just the speed that made Allied pilots feel like they'd time-traveled back to being terrified rookies. The Me 262 carried 430mm cannons mounted in its nose. Each gun fired shells the size of a man's forearm. Traditional fighter tactics relied on extended gun runs, pumping hundreds of 50-caliber rounds into an enemy aircraft until something critical shattered or caught fire. You'd chase a Focke-Wulf 190 across the sky, burning through ammunition belts, hoping to hit the engine or sever a control cable or ignite a fuel tank. The Me 262 didn't need sustained fire. Its cannons hit like naval artillery. A single 2-second burst could shred a B-17 Flying Fortress into tumbling metal debris. One pass through a bomber formation, and 3 heavy bombers would be staggering out of formation, engines streaming black smoke, wings shredded, control surfaces blown away. Then the jet would blast through the formation's opposite side, already accelerating back to altitude, untouchable, while the first damaged bomber started its death spiral toward the German countryside below. American fighter pilots had owned European skies for over a year. They'd learned to beat the FW-190 and its brutal roll rate. They'd adapted to the Bf-109's climbing ability and its tendency to stall in tight turns. They'd survived long enough to teach the new guys, to build institutional knowledge, to feel like they'd mastered their deadly trade. The Me 262 made them feel like frightened students again. Lieutenant Colonel John Meyer from the 302nd Fighter Group filed a combat report in August 1944 that read like a confession of impotence. His entire squadron had altitude advantage, numerical superiority, and the element of surprise, every tactical advantage. They were positioned perfectly for a textbook bounce. The Me 262 pilot saw them coming, lit his engines, and simply flew away. Meyer's wingmen didn't even get close enough to appear as blips on the Germans' radar warning receiver. They watched their target escape, while their own airspeed indicators hit the red line, while their engines screamed in protest, while they realized they were flying the second fastest aircraft in the sky, and it didn't matter at all. Intelligence reports flooded into 8th Air Force headquarters throughout August and September, each one more disturbing than the last. Bomber crews reported jets attacking from geometrically impossible angles, high 6 o'clock passes at closure rates exceeding 700 miles per hour. Fighter escorts documented Me-262s looping behind them at speeds that violated every principle of energy management and dogfighting theory. Generals sat in briefing rooms watching gun camera footage that showed American tracers falling uselessly behind jets that seemed to mock the fundamental laws of aviation. By September, the psychological impact on bomber crews was quantifiable and terrifying. Formations tightened up reflexively when jets were reported in the area, burning extra fuel on defensive maneuvers that accomplished absolutely nothing against an enemy who could choose his engagement time and range at will. Fighter groups burned through precious gasoline, chasing radar contacts that evaporated before anyone could get into firing position. The Germans had achieved something the Allied commanders thought impossible. They'd made American air superiority meaningless. The P-51 Mustang pilots took it personally, and that personal offense cut deep. These were men who'd cleared the skies over France, men who'd dueled with Germany's most decorated aces and emerged victorious more often than not. They'd escorted bomber streams all the way to Berlin and back, fighting through everything the Luftwaffe threw at them, watching friends die, but always pressing forward. They were the best fighter pilots in the world. Now they were reduced to spectators, orbiting helplessly while jets carved through bomber formations like sharks through a school of fish. October 19, 1944. The 357th Fighter Group is escorting a bombing run to Kassel. The mission brief was straightforward. Stay with the bombers, keep them safe. They've done this mission profile 100 times. The flight lead is relaxed, almost bored. Then, the radio explodes with urgency. Bandits, 12 o'clock high, 4 Me-262s diving from 28,000 feet. The Mustang squadron leader doesn't hesitate. He's already rolling into an intercept course before the transmission ends, his wingmen responding instantly, pouring on throttle, climbing hard to cut off the jets before they reach the bomber stream. Standard defensive maneuver. Perfect execution. They don't come close. The Me-262s blow through their intercept line like it doesn't exist, like the P-51s are painted on the sky. By the time the Mustangs reach combat altitude, gasping for air in the thin atmosphere, the jets are already in the bomber formation. Cannon flashes strobe in the distance. 3 B-17s stagger out of formation like wounded birds, their number 2 and 3 engines streaming fire. Control surfaces shredded by 30mm shells. The Mustang pilots reverse hard, diving after the attackers with everything their Merlins can give. Their airspeed builds rapidly in the dive, 400 miles per hour, 420, 435. Still not enough. The Me-262s are already gone, accelerating away at an angle no piston engine can match. Climbing back to altitude, while the Mustangs are left circling damaged bombers, counting parachutes, calling in rescue coordinates, feeling useless. This became the pattern that haunted every escort mission. Me-262s attacked with complete impunity, choosing the perfect moment, the perfect angle, always holding that speed advantage that made effective counterattack impossible. P-51 pilots started recognizing the warning signs instinctively, a contrail above the bomber formation, too straight, and too fast to be friendly. Then the radio call they'd learned to dread, jets inbound. They'd position themselves between the bombers and the threat, trying to use their numbers to create a defensive screen. The jets would adjust their approach vector by a few degrees and attack anyway, slashing through the fighter screen before anyone could react. Captain Chuck Yeager from the 363rd Fighter Squadron got close once. Just once. November 6, 1944, over Leipzig. He spotted an Me-262 setting up for a bomber pass and managed to position himself perfectly for a deflection shot. Yeager is one of the best instinctive shooters in the European theater. He knows how to lead a fast target, how to calculate deflection angles in his head, how to put bullets where the enemy is going to be instead of where he is. He fires a full burst, emptying half his ammunition. His tracers arc through empty air 600 feet behind the jet. The Me-262 pilot probably never knew Jaeger was there. He completes his attack run, drops one B-17 out of formation with a surgical burst, and exits at a shallow climb that puts him 3 miles away in 20 seconds. Jaeger watches him disappear and keys his mic to report another unsuccessful intercept. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. A P-51's 50 caliber rounds traveled at 2,800 feet per second. That sounds incredibly fast until you're trying to hit something moving 540 miles per hour, nearly 800 feet per second, on a perpendicular course. The deflection angles required were beyond what any human could calculate in real time while pulling Gs and watching for other threats and managing their own aircraft. Even when Mustang pilots positioned themselves perfectly, even when they led their targets by margins that felt completely wrong, their bullets cut through air the Me-262 had vacated a heartbeat earlier. Fighter groups started documenting their encounters with painful precision. Combat reports read like confessions: observed enemy jet aircraft, attempted intercept, enemy aircraft outran pursuit. Mission after mission, the story repeated with numbing consistency. The 8th Air Force's most experienced ACES men, with 10 or 15 confirmed kills men who'd survived, when most of their training class was dead, were being schooled by German pilots who'd figured out they didn't need to dogfight anymore. Just point the jet at the bombers. The Americans couldn't stop them. But one pilot was watching differently, and his different perspective would crack the problem wide open. Major Richard Connor from the 78th Fighter Group had stopped trying to catch Me-262s in flight. The futility was obvious after a dozen attempts. Instead, he started tracking where they came from and where they went, treating each encounter like an intelligence-gathering mission rather than a combat engagement. December 12, 1944. He's flying top cover over a bomber stream when 2 jets hit the formation with their usual devastating efficiency and vanish. Standard engagement. Every other pilot watches them disappear and curses. Connor doesn't chase. He marks the direction they departed. Southwest, low altitude, descending. He checks his fuel gauge, calculates his range, and follows at a distance, staying high enough to avoid detection. 15 miles out he spots them. 2 Me-262s on final approach to an airfield near Memmingen, gear down, flaps extended, crawling through the air at barely 200 miles per hour. They look wrong, like thoroughbreds being forced to walk, like predators with broken legs. Connor realizes he's watching the Luftwaffe's superweapon in its most vulnerable state, and suddenly the speed advantage means absolutely nothing. He's too far out to attack. His fuel situation doesn't allow for loitering. But he files a detailed observation in his combat report that evening, and buried in the bureaucratic language is one sentence that will change everything. Enemy jet aircraft observed at extremely low speed during landing approach. Aircraft appeared vulnerable to interception during this phase. Other pilots had seen it too, but Connor was the first to document the pattern systematically to recognize it wasn't a fluke. Me-262s didn't just slow down near their airfields. They had to. The Jumo 04 turbojets weren't like piston engines where you could chop the throttle and the power dropped instantly. Slam the throttles closed on an early turbojet, and the engines flamed out completely. The compressor blades would stall. Combustion would collapse. The pilot would be flying a very expensive, very heavy glider, so Me-262 pilots had to reduce power gradually over several miles, extending their approach, maintaining just enough thrust to keep the turbojets spinning while bleeding speed through drag. This created a window, a narrow tactical opportunity that lasted maybe 30 to 45 seconds. During final approach, and Me-262 was slower than a P-51. Not by much, but enough. The jet pilot was committed to his landing pattern, unable to abort without risking a flameout. His attention was split between airspeed, altitude, and runway alignment. His engines were in a delicate power state, where aggressive maneuvering could cause compressor stalls. His gear and flaps were deployed, creating massive drag that killed any chance of rapid acceleration. And he was low, under 1,000 feet with no altitude to trade for energy if someone jumped him. Lieutenant Colonel Elwin Rigetti from the 55th Fighter Group confirmed Connor's observation in late December. He'd shadowed a Me 262 back to its base near Acma, staying high enough to avoid detection, watching with predatory focus. He saw the jet enter its landing pattern with gear coming down 2 miles from the runway threshold. The aircraft's silhouette changed instantly from sleek and menacing to ungainly and vulnerable. Rigetti realized why the Luftwaffe was protecting these airfields with heavy flak batteries positioned in concentric rings. The jets didn't need protection in the air, where they were untouchable. They needed it when they came home. Takeoff was even worse from a vulnerability standpoint, and Me 262 needed nearly 6,000 feet of runway to get airborne, almost double what a Bf 109 required. The turbojets took time to spool up to full power, and the aircraft was heavy at 15,000 pounds fully loaded. Pilots had to run the engines up to maximum thrust while holding the brakes, waiting for the instruments to stabilize. Then they'd release brakes and hold the nose down while the jet accelerated, staying glued to the runway until airspeed built to 120 miles per hour. For 45 seconds, they were accelerating in a perfectly straight line, locked to the runway heading, unable to maneuver. If something went wrong during that window, if an engine failed or a compressor stalled, they couldn't abort. The Me 262 didn't have enough runway behind it to stop with that much speed already built, and it didn't have enough speed ahead to fly on one engine. Word spread through fighter groups like wildfire. The Me 262 wasn't invincible. It was just invincible in the air. On the ground, approaching the ground, leaving the ground, that's where it bled. That's where the physics equation reversed. The problem was written into the fundamental nature of jet propulsion itself. Ernst Heinkel and Hans von Ohain had solved the thrust equation, creating an engine that could push an aircraft faster than any propeller-driven design. But they'd also created a temperamental beast that demanded constant attention and careful handling. The Jumo 004 turbojet worked by compressing air through a series of rotating blades, mixing it with fuel, igniting the mixture in a combustion chamber, and expelling the expanding gases through a turbine and exhaust nozzle. Simple in theory, nightmarish in practice when you're operating at the absolute edge of 1940s metallurgy and engineering capability. The compressor blades inside those engines were spinning at 8,900 revolutions per minute, creating compression ratios that pushed German steel to its absolute limits. Feed fuel too quickly, and the temperature inside the combustion chamber spiked past the melting point of the turbine blades. The engine would literally eat itself from the inside out, metal warping and failing in seconds, turning a revolutionary aircraft into a falling coffin. Pull the throttle back too fast and airflow through the compressor disrupted, creating a phenomenon called compressor stall. Essentially, a violent backfire inside the engine that killed thrust instantly and could damage internal components beyond repair. German mechanics were finding destroyed turbine sections that looked like they'd been attacked with hammers. So Me 262 pilots flew with one hand, always babying their throttles, making smooth, incremental adjustments, waiting 3 to 4 seconds between power changes for the engines to stabilize. In combat at altitude, this was manageable. You had time, you had options. During takeoff and landing, when you're low and slow with the ground rushing up, it was absolutely terrifying. Imagine needing to make an emergency go-around on a landing approach because another aircraft is blocking the runway. In a P-51, you slam the throttle forward and the engine responds instantly. You're climbing in 2 seconds. In a Me 262, your engines need 15 seconds of gradual throttle increase before they'll deliver full power. That's not responsive flight control. That's a countdown to impact. The low-speed handling characteristics made everything worse. The Me 262's swept wing design was revolutionary for high-speed flight. It delayed the onset of compressibility effects that plagued straight-wing aircraft approaching the speed of sound. But swept wings generate less lift at low speeds. They stall earlier and more aggressively than straight wings. Below 220 miles per hour, the Me 262 handled like a truck with bald tires on ice. The controls got mushy and unresponsive. The aircraft wanted to drop a wing without warning. Pilots had to maintain precise airspeed during approach, threading a needle between too slow and too fast. Too fast and they'd overrun the runway, because the brakes weren't designed for high-speed landing. The same wing configuration that made the Me-262 untouchable at 500 miles per hour made it dangerously vulnerable at 150. German test pilots at Rechlin reported that the aircraft required constant control inputs during landing approaches with almost no margin for error. Any disturbance in airflow or power setting, and the aircraft wanted to swap ends, to spin, to do anything except maintain controlled flight. The engine response lag compounded every problem. A P-51 pilot misjudging his landing approach could add power instantly and go around. And Me-262 pilot misjudging his approach had to plan his recovery 15 seconds in advance, smoothly advancing throttles while praying both engines spooled up evenly. If one engine responded slower than the other, the asymmetric thrust would yaw the aircraft violently at the worst possible moment when you're low, slow, and close to the ground. Those Jumo 004s produced only 1,900 pounds of thrust each at sea level, barely enough to overcome the Me-262's weight and aerodynamic drag. The aircraft needed every inch of those 6,000 feet to accelerate to flying speed. He could only hold the center line and wait for the airspeed indicator to creep up to 120 miles per hour, knowing that somewhere above him, American fighters might be watching. Fighter group commanders started circulating a new term in January 1945, rat catching. The concept was elegant in its brutality. If you can't catch the rat in the open field while it's running at full speed, wait at the entrance to its hole and kill it when it slows down. Me-262 bases became known quantities. Intelligence had identified the primary jet airfields through photo reconnaissance and prisoner interrogation. Rheine-Hopsten, Achmer, Hesepe, Lechfeld, Memmingen. Every Me-262 that attacked Allied bombers had to return to one of these bases eventually. The 357th Fighter Group tried the tactic first in early January. Instead of flying protective orbits around the bomber stream, they climbed to 15,000 feet and positioned themselves 5 miles from Achmer Airfield along the known approach path. 20 minutes of circling, scanning the sky, watching fuel gauges tick down. Then England spotted them. He rolled in from above and behind, closing the range while the jets were committed to their landing pattern. His first burst caught the trailing Me-262 in the left engine nacelle. The pilot had no choice but to continue the landing with asymmetric thrust, fighting the yaw, struggling with mushy controls. England followed him down to 300 feet and fired again. German flak crews knew exactly what the Americans were trying. They'd positioned quad-mount 20mm guns and 88mm batteries in overlapping fields of fire around their jet bases. Any P-51 that lingered in the area was entering a steel curtain of exploding shells. He made it back to base trailing white glycol vapor, his engine temperature gauge buried in the red, knowing he was maybe 30 seconds from complete engine seizure. But the kills kept coming, and that's all headquarters cared about. The numbers justified the risk. January 15th. Lieutenant Robert Ammon from the 339th Fighter Group caught an Me-262 on final approach to Rhein-Hopsten, one firing pass, 250 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition walking up the fuselage. January 22nd. Captain Donald Botchke from the 357th got 2 Me-262s in a single mission, both during landing attempts at Memmingen. The first pilot saw him too late, already committed with gear down and power reduced. He tried to maneuver to break away from the attack, but at that speed, the Me-262's controls were too sluggish to respond. Botchke's gun camera footage showed the jet wallowing through turns like a heavy bomber, while his tracers walked methodically into the fuselage. 8th Air Force Command watched the results with deeply conflicted interest. But losses were climbing too. Low-altitude missions meant extended exposure to light flak that could shred a fighter before the pilot knew he was being tracked. 3 P-51s lost for every 2 Me-262s killed wasn't sustainable mathematics. Not when you factored in training time, experience levels, and the strategic value of a veteran fighter pilot versus a jet that might fly 20 missions before mechanical failure grounded it permanently. General William Kepner, commander of a 8 Fighter Command, initially issued guidance discouraging airfield attacks. Too risky, too costly. Focus on protecting the bombers at altitude where you have tactical advantages, but bomber losses to Me 262s kept mounting with sickening regularity. That's 470 trained aircrew killed or captured. The men flying those B-17s didn't care about sustainable loss ratios or long-term strategic planning. They cared about surviving their 25th mission so they could go home. We're putting 10 aircraft over the target and coming back with 6. The mathematics are simple and terrible. By late February, Kepner reversed his guidance completely. No orbiting below 10,000 feet where flak could shred you. No pursuing damaged jets into known anti-aircraft ranges. Mandatory wingman coverage for any pilot making an attack run. Fighter groups started timing their patrols to coincide with known Me 262 operational patterns. Dawn and dusk, when low sun angles made the fighters harder to spot from the ground. But while the tactical fight was happening in the skies over Germany, an equally intense bureaucratic battle was playing out in conference rooms far from the combat zone. At 8th Air Force headquarters in High Wycombe, England, staff officers were running calculations that kept producing impossible results. Fighter Command had lost 14 P-51s in January during airfield attacks. They'd killed 9 Me 262s. The exchange ratio favored the Germans. Worse, those 14 Mustang pilots represented thousands of training hours, hundreds of combat missions worth of institutional knowledge, and irreplaceable tactical expertise. You couldn't replace a captain with 25 missions and 8 kills with a lieutenant fresh from stateside who'd never seen combat. The experience differential was worth more than the raw aircraft count. Major General Frederick Anderson, Deputy Commander for Operations, looked at the spreadsheets and saw unsustainable attrition. Fighter groups were losing experienced flight leaders to flak during low-altitude attacks that violated every principle of air superiority doctrine his generation had developed. The whole point of long-range escort fighters was to protect bombers at altitude, not to go brawling at treetop level with ground defenses that could kill you before you heard the shell that did it. He drafted a directive in early February. Let the bombers' defensive firepower and formation discipline handle the jet threat. Focus on what you do best. Colonel Hubert Zemke from the 479th Fighter Group sent a response through channels that his staff later described as blistering. His pilots had just confirmed 3 Me 262 kills in 5 days using airfield tactics. Yes, they'd lost 1 P-51 to flak. But those 3 jets would have killed at minimum a dozen bombers if left unchecked. Every Me 262 shot down on approach was 20 bombers that didn't get shredded by 30mm cannons. It was 200 aircrew who didn't die screaming as their aircraft broke apart at 25,000 feet. They were bleeding to death at altitude. March 2nd, Me 262s from Jagdgeschwader 7 hit a formation over Magdeburg and dropped 11 B-17s in 6 minutes of clinical destruction. The fighter escort never got close to the jets. Bomber crews came back traumatized, demanding answers that nobody could give them. Where were the fighters that were supposed to protect them? Why were the Germans allowed to take off, attack at will, and land without being challenged? Why were we dying so that fighter pilots could avoid dangerous missions? And terrified crews that shooting down jets at their airfields was considered too expensive in the grand strategic calculation. Behind the bureaucratic fight was an older doctrinal argument that had haunted the Army Air Forces since before the war started. Strategic bombing advocates believed heavy bombers could win wars through industrial destruction, that fighter escorts were a temporary concession to unfavorable tactical conditions. Once you destroyed enough factories and refineries, enemy air power would collapse from lack of resources. Fighter advocates believed air superiority was the absolute prerequisite for everything else. The Me 262 had turned this theoretical argument into immediate life-or-death crisis. If fighters couldn't establish air superiority against jets at altitude, where they held every traditional advantage, did they have an obligation to establish it on the ground regardless of cost? Was it acceptable to lose experienced pilots to flak if it meant bomber crews survived? General Karl Spaatz, commanding all U.S. strategic air forces in Europe, forced the issue in mid-February. He called a conference at 8th Air Force headquarters with bomber and fighter commanders physically present in the same room. No more written reports, face-to-face confrontation. The bomber generals laid out their casualties with brutal clarity. 47 heavies lost to jets in February. 281 men killed or missing. The psychological impact on crews who had to fly, knowing they were helpless against jet attacks. The fighter generals presented their Me-262 kill counts and their own losses. The tactical innovations. The proven success rate once pilots learned the vulnerabilities. Spaatz listened to both sides, then made the calculation that ended the debate. The Luftwaffe had approximately 200 Me-262s operational across all units. At current loss rates from bomber defensive fire and mechanical failures, Allied bomber crews would suffer 3,000 casualties before the jet threat was neutralized through attrition. Fighter losses from aggressive airfield attacks might cost 200 pilots, still terrible, still unacceptable in any normal calculation, but manageable compared to the alternative of letting the jets operate freely. The directive went out February 27, 1945. Fighter groups were authorized and actively encouraged to conduct aggressive operations against jet airfields. High Command would accept the increased fighter losses as the calculated price of protecting the bomber offensive. The strategic bombing campaign had to continue. Jets threatened to make it impossible. But there were parameters that couldn't be violated. Attacks had to be coordinated with intelligence about jet activity. Fighter groups had to maintain enough high-altitude escorts to protect bombers from conventional Luftwaffe fighters, and pilots had to follow engagement protocols that minimized exposure to flak. The rat-catching missions became official doctrine, written into operational orders, with dedicated flights assigned specifically to hunt Me-262s during their most vulnerable moments. March opened with a bloodbath for the Luftwaffe's jet units. The first week alone saw 14 Me-262s destroyed during takeoff or landing attempts. Fighter groups had refined their tactics into a brutal science that German pilots couldn't counter. They'd learned the timing with precision. Me-262s typically launched in pairs between 10 and 1100 hours, returning between 13 and 1400 hours. Predictable patterns created fatal vulnerabilities. They'd mapped the approach patterns at every major jet base. They'd calculated the exact moment when a jet committed to landing. That point of no return when adding power wouldn't save you because the engines needed too long to spool up. Chuck Yeager got his first jet kill on March 24th. He'd been orbiting southwest of Acme with his flight when he spotted a Me-262 on final approach 2 miles from the runway. Yeager came in from the jet's 7 o'clock position, using the sun behind him to mask his approach, closing from 3,000 feet, while the German pilot was focused entirely on his landing. At 800 yards, Yeager opened fire. His first burst missed. He'd underestimated how slow the Me-262 was moving. His mental deflection calculation, based on intercepting a target at 400 miles per hour instead of 180. He corrected immediately, walked his tracers forward, and caught the jet squarely in the right engine nacelle. The Me-262 didn't explode dramatically. It just settled into a gentle descent, too low to recover, and pancaked into a field beside the runway. The pilot got out and ran, waving his arms. Yeager's wingman spotted him and radioed, "He's waving at us." They'd just killed Germany's most advanced fighter with Depression-era tactics. Catch them on the ground when they're slow and vulnerable. Donald Boschke from the 357th was becoming a specialist in jet killing. By March 29th, he'd claimed 5 Me-262s, all of them caught during landing or takeoff. His technique was different from most pilots and significantly more dangerous. Instead of attacking from directly behind in a stern chase, he'd position himself perpendicular to the runway, hidden in ground clutter at low altitude where radar couldn't track him effectively. When a Me-262 started its takeoff roll, Boschke would wait until the jet was committed, nose down, accelerating past the point where the pilot could abort safely. Then he'd swing onto the runway heading and fire from the side in a pure deflection shot. The hardest type of shooting in all of aerial combat, but the Me-262 was locked into a completely predictable flight path. It couldn't break left or right. It couldn't climb. It could only hold the center line and pray the American missed. Boschke rarely missed. His gun camera footage from one mission showed a Me-262 just lifting off, main gear retracting, airspeed maybe 130 miles per hour. His .50 caliber rounds raked the fuselage from wing root to tail in a perfectly straight line. The jet's nose pitched up violently. It rolled inverted and slammed back into the runway upside down. Total time from first shot to impact, 3 seconds. April became catastrophic for the Germans. The 78th Fighter Group established a dedicated jet hunting section, 4 aircraft that did nothing but patrol known Me-262 bases in rotating shifts. Between April 1st and April 15th, they claimed 19 confirmed kills. The 357th added 16 more to their tally. The 4th Fighter Group, always competitive and intensely proud of their kill counts, went after the numbers aggressively and posted 13 kills in 10 days. The tactics evolved past simple ambush into coordinated pack hunting. Pilots started working in pairs with specific roles. One P-51 would orbit high at 12,000 feet, watching for jets returning to base and calling out their approach vectors over the radio. His wingman would position low, hidden against terrain or in cloud layers waiting for the call. When the Me-262 committed to its landing pattern, when it was at its most vulnerable with gear down and flaps extended, the low fighter would intercept from below and behind, attacking from the jet pilot's worst blind spot. By the time the Germans saw the threat, his engines were already reduced to landing power, his gear and flaps were deployed creating massive drag, and he was 300 feet above the ground with no energy to maneuver. Some Me-262 pilots tried to fight back during approach, attempting aggressive defensive maneuvers. Bad idea. Fatal idea. Attempting hard turns at low speed just accelerated the inevitable. The jets would stall a wing, snap into a flat spin too low to recover, and auger straight into the ground before the P-51 even fired a shot. Other pilots tried high-speed approaches, diving toward the runway to maintain energy for a potential go-around. That just gave American pilots a faster-moving target on a completely predictable flight path, with no ability to deviate. By mid-April 1945, the Luftwaffe's jet units were flying fewer and fewer sorties, not primarily because of P-51 attacks, though those had absolutely gutted their pilot rosters and destroyed morale. The real problem was simpler and more devastating. They had no fuel. Germany's synthetic fuel plants had been pounded into smoking rubble by Allied bombers throughout March in a systematic campaign that finally achieved what years of bombing had promised. The refineries at Leuna, Perlitz and Brooks, facilities that had produced 80% of the Luftwaffe's aviation gasoline, were smoking craters surrounded by twisted machinery. What little fuel remained was being hoarded by local commanders for mythical last-stand operations that existed only on paper, defensive operations that would never happen because the war was already lost. Jagdgeschwader 7, the primary Me-262 fighter unit, reported on April 14th that they had fuel for 3 days of operations. Not 3 days of continuous combat, 3 days total if they rationed every sortie, if they launched only 4-ship flights instead of full squadrons, if they limited patrol time to 30 minutes per mission. Adolf Galland, who'd taken command of JV-44, an elite unit flying Me-262s staffed with Germany's most experienced aces, watched his fuel stockpile drain from 60,000 liters in early March to less than 8,000 by mid-April. His pilots sat in ready rooms next to fully armed, perfectly functional jets that represented the pinnacle of German aviation technology. They couldn't fly because the fuel tanks were empty. The airfields were dying too, systematically destroyed by Allied attacks. Fighter bombers had switched from hunting individual jets to cratering the runways themselves, making the bases unusable. A B-26 Marauder group hit Lechfeld on April 18th and dropped 500-pound bombs in a precise pattern across both runways, guided by aerial photographs that showed exactly where to place the craters for maximum disruption. The resulting craters were 15 feet deep and 30 feet across, impossible to fill quickly. Even patched sections couldn't handle the weight and impact stress of a Me-262's landing gear at touchdown speeds. The concrete would just collapse again. Memmingen took similar systematic damage on April 20th. Rainer Hopsten was hit so many times the ground crews stopped counting individual craters and just marked which sections of pavement were still theoretically intact. So the jets scattered into the countryside. Luftwaffe commanders ordered their remaining Me-262s dispersed into forests, hidden under camouflage netting along tree lines, parked in farm fields, concealed in barns. The idea was preservation. Keep the aircraft safe until fuel supplies could be resumed, until runways could be repaired, until the military situation somehow improved. None of those things happened. None of them were ever going to happen. American ground forces were already across the Rhine, driving deep into Germany. Soviet armies were closing on Berlin from the east. The war was over in everything but formal declaration, just waiting for the final paperwork. Pilots found their jets parked in increasingly bizarre locations. 3 Me-262s sat under oak trees near a Bavarian dairy farm, wings barely clearing the branches. 2 more were tucked into a pine grove where the branches scraped the tail surfaces every time wind blew. 1 was hidden inside a barn, wings removed, fuselage covered with hay like some kind of aviation burial. The dispersal was supposed to save them from air attack and systematic destruction. Instead, it just made them completely inaccessible and operationally useless. Without fuel trucks, without maintenance facilities, without organized logistics networks that had already collapsed, the jets might as well have been museum pieces. Ground crews did what they could to keep the aircraft technically functional. They hand-pumped fuel from barrels when they could find any. They scavenged parts from damaged jets to keep others airworthy. But airworthy didn't mean flyable in any practical sense, and Me-262 needed a 6,000-foot runway. These dispersed bases were farm fields, forest roads, and stretches of autobahn. None long enough, none smooth enough, none suitable for an aircraft that required perfect conditions even under ideal circumstances. The last recorded Me-262 combat sortie happened on May 2, 1945. A pilot from JV-44 managed to take off from a partially damaged section of Memmingen, intercepted a reconnaissance P-38 Lightning, missed with all his ammunition, and landed at a dispersed base near Salzburg. His aircraft was pushed under trees and abandoned 3 days later when American ground forces arrived in the area. Intelligence teams found over 200 Me-262s scattered across Germany in May and June, discovered in forests and hidden under bridges and parked in village squares. Most had less than 50 hours total flight time. Some had never been fueled. A few had never even had their weapons installed. Germany's superweapon, the jet that was supposed to change the entire trajectory of the air war, ended its service life rotting under camouflage nets in Bavarian forests while its pilots hitchhiked home through the ruins of their country. The jet that broke every rule of air combat had been beaten by the oldest rule of warfare. Speed doesn't matter if you can't fight. Technology doesn't matter if you can't fuel it. And invincibility doesn't exist when physics demands you slow down eventually. The Americans learned to kill the unkillable by waiting for the moment when the impossible became merely difficult. Then they did what they'd always done best. They adapted, they innovated, they paid the price, and they won.